For 20 years, Elizabeth Stanton's family had mocked her for loving a penniless scholar, a phantom they called him, a foolish girl's dream. Her sister in law declared she would die a spinster, having tasted neither marriage nor love. Now at 40, she was a permanent, invisible guest in her brother's London home, her only comfort the faded memory of a young man. When her arrogant brother invited the illustrious newly arrived Marquis of Silverwood to dinner, Elizabeth had expected another tedious evening of humiliation. Nothing could have prepared her for the guest of honor who walked through the door. But that was still hours away. First, there was the morning to endure. The morning at Havelock House did not so much stream into the breakfast room as it seeped, diluted by London's perpetual haze and the heavy damask drapes Lady Imogen deemed fashionable. The room smelled of strong coffee, kippered herring, and a subtler, more acrid scent, dissatisfaction. Elizabeth Stanton sat with her spine perfectly aligned, a skill learned over so many years of navigating meals that were manor battlefields. She was a study in quiet preservation, her faded moss green morning dress, her once golden hair neatly coiled and threaded with silver at temples. I trust you slept well, sister, Algernon Stanton, Baron of Havelock, declared without looking up from his newspaper. No wandering the halls with your candle again, I hope. Wax is not inexpensive, and Martha has duties beyond following you about. I slept quite adequately, thank you, Algernon, Elizabeth said, her voice a low, clear note in the stuffy room. She took a precise sip of tea, the cup steady in her hand. Across the table, Lady Imogen made a soft, derisive sound. Adequate sleep is a blessing for those with empty days to fill. I, of course, was awake half the night finalizing the guest list for our soiree. One must cultivate the right connections. Her eyes swept over Elizabeth's simple dress. Perhaps you might have a new gown. That one seems to have faded. It serves its purpose, Elizabeth replied, meeting her sister in law's gaze for a fleeting second before looking down at her plate. A direct stare was an escalation, a modest glance was a strategic retreat. Purpose, Algernon scoffed, folding his paper with a crackle. A woman's purpose is to adorn, to elevate, not to serve. Speaking of elevation, I expect you both to be in particularly fine form in the coming days. I am to meet the Marquis of Silverwood at the club to lay the groundwork. If I succeed, he will be in our drawing room soon enough, and you must be ready. The title, grand and unfamiliar, landed in the room like a costly ornament. It meant nothing to Elizabeth, but another empty name from the peerage. A marquis, Imogen breathed, her irritation forgotten. But the Silverwood title, it was dormant for years, was it not? Precisely, Algernon said, his chest inflating. The old marquis died nearly a decade ago without a direct heir. The title passed to a nephew so distant no one knew his name. He's been living abroad, Italy or perhaps the Indies for years. A complete mystery. But he's finally come to home to claim his seat, a man of vast fortune with no connections here and no understanding of how things are done. His eyes gleamed. He will need a great deal of guidance and the right partners if I can secure his interest. We must have him to dinner, Imogen declared. We shall be the first in Bloomsbury to snare him. Imagine a peer of such standing at our table. We must present a picture of impeccable, substantial family life. No oddities, no shadows. Her gaze, like Algernon's, flicked to Elizabeth, who had become a statue holding a teacup. It was at this moment that John, their 19-year-old son, bounded into the room, a breath of Cambridge air trapped in his tousled hair and earnest eyes. Morning, father, mother, Aunt Elizabeth. His nod to her was warmer, a tiny conspiracy of kindness. He slid into the chair beside her. Talking commerce already. It's not yet 8. We are talking of opportunity, John, Algernon corrected. The kind that secures future. You would do well to listen. I listen better on a full stomach, John said cheerfully, earning a disapproving sniff from his mother and a hidden grateful curve of Elizabeth's lips. The conversation moved on, a barge of plans and pretensions sailing over her head. Imogen began dissecting the potential flaws of every other family who might vie for the Marquis's attention. Algernon pontificated on the man's rumored estates, his income, his political potential. Then, as it so often did, the talk turned, a knife blade finding a familiar groove. Of course, Imogen said, her voice laced with false sweetness. Not every young man possesses such foresight or fortune. Some are led astray by fleeting fancies. Isn't that so, Elizabeth? Elizabeth's knuckle whitened on her cutlery. Algernon chuckled. Ah, yes, the penniless scholar. What was his name? Beaumont. A nobody with more Latin than land. As I recall, father did the family a service there, sent him packing with his tails between his legs. No doubt he came to his senses, Imogen purred. He likely thanks Providence daily for his escape. Married some sensible plain country girl, no doubt, and is blissfully unaware of the narrow miss he had. She took a delicate bite of toast. Spinsterhood can be a kindness, in certain cases, saves a great deal of disappointment for all involved. John's folk stilled. He looked at his aunt, but Elizabeth's face was pale, smooth mask. Her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the sideboard. She had perfected this art of absence. I find the past a poor topic for digestion, she said, her voice so quiet it almost vanished. If you'll excuse me, I believe I need to attend to some correspondence that has been too long delayed. She rose, her movements graceful and automatic. The jibes followed her to the door, but she did not hear them. She was already retreating into the fortress of her mind, the only place where the walls of Havelock House could not confine her. Alone in the dim, chilly corridor, the mask dissolved. A tremor ran through her. George. They had spoken his name. It was a small private torture they inflicted without knowing its true power. She had not go to the small writing desk in the upstairs parlor. Instead, she passed its door and climbed the stairs to her own small chamber. From the bottom of a cedar chest beneath layers of practical wool, her fingers found a small flat bundle wrapped in soft linen. Sitting on the narrow bed, she unfolded it. Inside lay a single dried forget me not. Its blue faded to a ghost of itself, pressed between two pages of a book. The book was a volume of Cowper's poetry. A faint inscription in a strong young hand was on the flyleaf. To E.S., who alone understands the quiet verses. G.B. George Beaumont. He had given it to her after they'd discussed a poem at a village picnic. He was a scholar from Oxford then, visiting a friend in their Hampshire countryside. He had no title, no prospects beyond his own keen mind. He had seen shy Elizabeth, the quiet girl's other overlooked, and he had not looked away. He had spoken to her of ideas, of history, of things that mattered. He had made her feel seen. The courtship was a handful of stolen moments. When he proposed, standing in the dappled light of her father's orchard, it was with a grave, hopeful earnestness that had shattered her cautious word into a kaleidoscope of joy. Her father's rejection was a frost, a cold, definitive statement about blood and land. A clever mind fills no coffers, Elizabeth. He is not for you. George had left the county. She heard vaguely he had gone to continue his studies in literature, then abroad. The light went out. Her life became a series of smaller and smaller rooms. What followed was the gradual dimming. Her mother fell into a long, slow illness, and Elizabeth's world shrank to the sick room, while her younger brother, Algernon, departed for London to make his fortune. She stayed behind a dutiful daughter, a quiet wallflower in a house of shadows. Her father, the Baron, grew more entrenched in his prejudices. The rare proposals that came her way were dismissed by him with the same disdain he'd shown George. Beneath you, he'd mutter, though she never understood. What, if anything, he believed was worthy of a baron's daughter? Her mother's death a few years later was a release for both patient and nurse. The baron's swift decline and death soon after felt like the final expected page in a sad short book. With no home and no income, the small quiet room of her youth were exchanged for a new gilded cage, her brother's prosperous London house, where he had inherited the title and acquired a wife and a profound sense of his own importance. His family's mockery was a salt in a wound that had never truly closed. They thought they were taunting her about a foolish girl's fantasy. They did not know they were profaning the one sacred real thing she had ever possessed. She traced the brittle petals of the flower. She had never forgotten him. How could she? He was not a mere memory, he was the ghost of the life she might have lived, the echo of a voice that had called her by her true name, a voice silenced 2 decades ago. With a sigh that was more habit than sorrow, she wrapped the book and its fragile keepsake back in its shroud and returned it to the dark. The past was the country closed to her. The present was the room, this house, this life of being a shadow at the breakfast table. That was all she had and all she would ever have. My dear listener, before we continue, I want to share something with you. From now on, I will narrate my stories by myself. English is not my first language, my accent is not fancy, but my love for these stories is real. I work hard on every word, every feeling, and every whisper. So please be gentle with me, and after you finish listening, leave me a comment. Tell me how you feel. Your words truly matter to me. And now, with a full heart, let us return to Havelock House. The meeting at the club was successful, and the evening of the dinner arrived, cloaking Havelock House in a brittle perfumed tension. Elizabeth stood before her cheval glass, attended by Martha. The gown was not new. Such extravagance was not allotted to her, but it was her best. A deep sapphire silk, its color reminiscent of a midnight sky or a long faded forget me not. It was modest, with a high neckline and long sleeves, but the rich fabric caught the candlelight in soft waves, and it did not, as Imogen had predicted, make her look sallow. It made her look composed, like a portrait of a lady who had outlived frivolity. It suits you, Miss Elizabeth, Martha murmured, giving the skirt a final affectionate pat. Has a quiet dignity about it. Dignity will be in short supply downstairs, Martha, Elizabeth replied. But she offered her loyal maid a small tight smile. It was armor, this dress. She would need it. The drawing room was a stage set for ambition. Algernon prowled before the fire, his chest puffed out in a waistcoat of alarming stripe. Imogen was a vision of clashing silks and aggressive rubies, her eyes sharp as pins as they scanned Elizabeth's entrance. The dark color is somber, Imogen pronounced, but I suppose it is appropriate. We cannot all shimmer. She turned to her son. John, do not slouch, and for heaven's sake, do not talk of horseflesh or Cambridge debates. Be agreeable. John, handsome in his evening black, winked at his aunt when his mother's back was turned. He was her anchor in the swirling sea of pretense. The clock ticked with torturous slowness. Then the sound they had all been straining for, the crunch of carriage wheels on gravel, the authoritative rap of the door knocker. A hush fell, broken only by the rustle of Imogen's skirt as she positioned herself for maximum effect. The drawing room doors swung open. The most honorable, the Marquis of Silverwood, the butler intoned. He entered, and the room seemed to shrink. He was tall, his bearing erect without being rigid, carrying the authority of his title with an unknowing ease. His hair was dark, threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, swept back from a strong, thoughtful brow. He was a man in the very prime of his life, past the flush of youth, his presence tempered into something more substantial and commanding. But it was his eyes that struck Elizabeth first, deep set, intelligent, and a dark, penetrating brown. that seemed to take in the entirety of the scene in one swift, comprehensive glance. His features were strong, etched with the lines of a life fully lived. He was not classically handsome, but compelling, a magnetic force in impeccably tailored evening clothes. Algernon surged forward, bowing too deeply. My lord Marquis, a profound honor, welcome to Havelock House. May I present my wife, Lady Imogen? Imogen sank into a curtsy so low it was a feat of engineering. We are utterly delighted, my lord. Your presence illuminates our humble home. The Marquis inclined his head, his expression politely inscrutable. Lord Havelock, Lady Havelock, your invitation was most kind. His voice, oh yes, his voice, it was deeper now, weathered but the timbre, the clean, educated cadence, was a bell struck in the deepest vault of Elizabeth's memory. Her breath hitched, silent and trapped in her throat. It cannot be, she thought. And our son John up at Cambridge, Algernon blustered on. John gave a respectful bow, meeting the Marquis's gaze with a frank, pleasant expression. A pleasure, sir. And this, Imogen said, her gesture towards Elizabeth dismissive, is Lord Havelock's sister, Mrs. Stanton. She resides with us. Elizabeth forced her leaden feet to carry her forward. She dipped into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the floor, terrified that if she looked up, the world would fracture. Do not look, do not see, she thought. Mrs. Stanton, the sound of her name in that voice, here, now, was an agony and an ecstasy so acute she felt dizzy. She raised her eyes. His gaze met hers. There was no shock on his face, no widening of those dark eyes, only a profound still intensity, like the calm at the center of a storm. He gave the slightest, most formal nod. A pleasure. He shows nothing. He does not know me. It's not him. This is a spectre, a cruel trick of time. But her heart, a frantic bird, knew. It knew the curve of his jaw, the set of his mouth. Mrs. Stanton is our quiet ornament, Imogen chirped, linking her arm through Algernon's. Quite content with her books and her sewing. Not one for society's whirl. Are you, Elizabeth? I'm drowning, she thought. I'm falling through the floor. I find great solace in quiet pursuits, my lady, Elizabeth heard herself say, her own voice sounding miles away. They offer a different kind of society. Indeed, the Marquis said, his eyes still holding hers, though his words were addressed to the room, the society of great minds across centuries, a more select and often more rewarding circle. His words were a perfectly crafted social remark. To her, they were a coded message, a fragment of a conversation from under an oak tree a lifetime ago. He remembers. He must, she thought. For a dizzying second, the polished lord vanished, and Elizabeth saw only George, his eyes holding the same earnest light as he quoted Cowper on a sun dappled hill. Yet a lifetime of silence warned her not to grasp at phantoms. He was a marquis now, making conversations. That was all, wasn't it? The party moved into dinner. Elizabeth was placed halfway down the table opposite John. The Marquis, of course, was at Imogen's right hand. Elizabeth was grateful for the distance, for the barrier of crystal and silver. The conversation was Algernon's monologue on shipping routes, punctuated by Imogen's fluttering interjections. The Marquis listened, nodded, asked a keen question that revealed a grasp of the subject that clearly unsettled Algernon. He was impeccably courteous, but there was a reserve, a watchfulness about him. Then, during a lull, as a course was changed, Imogen's needle found its mark again. You must find our family dinner a tame affair, my lord, not like the gatherings you must be used to. We are a simple domestic circle, though we did try to broaden our dear Elizabeth's horizons. I even brought a most eligible cousin to meet her, a man in trade, but with solid prospects. But our Elizabeth is particular. She refused him outright. She gave a tinkling laugh. I sometimes think she is waiting for a phantom, a knight from an old sad story. The air left the room. John stared at his plate, his cheeks flushing with anger on his aunt's behalf. Algernon shifted uncomfortably. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at her hands clenched in her lap under the table. The Marquis set his wineglass down with a soft, definitive click. The sound drew every eye. His dark gaze was on Imogen, and though his tone was mild, it carried a chill that silenced her simpering smile. Discernment in matters of heart is not a flaw, Lady Havelock, he said, each word measured. It is a rare form of courage. To refuse a safe harbor for want of a true north, that is not being particular, that is being principled. He paused, and his eyes flicked, just for an instant, to Elizabeth's stricken face. A phantom, you say? I have always found phantoms to be born of substance, more real than we credit. They are often the echoes of truths we were once brave enough to feel. The silence that followed was absolute. Imogen looked as if she had been slapped with a velvet glove. He's defending me. He knows. He sees it all, Elizabeth thought. Her blood, so long still, seemed to roar in her ears, a tumult of decades dead feeling roaring back to life. John broke the silence smoothly, steering the talk to a recent exhibition at the Royal Academy. The moment passed, but the earthquake had occurred. The foundations of Elizabeth's carefully constructed prison had cracked. For the rest of the evening, they did not speak directly again, but she was acutely aware of him, a constant magnetic pull across the room. When the Marquis finally took his leave, with promises to Algernon of a future meeting at the club that sent her brother into raptures, he bowed over her hand last. His fingers barely brushed her glove, yet the contact was a brand, a point of searing heat in the chill formality of the room. His gaze, dark and intense, held hers, not the polite glance of a departing guest, but a look that seemed to shudder out the very presence of her brother, the glittering crowd, the weight of the years. In that look was a private universe of memory and longing. Good evening, Mrs. Stanton, he said, his voice so low it was almost a vibration felt rather than heard. Your fortitude is remarkable. The word was a caress, a testament, and a shared secret all at once. You have returned as a king, crowned by fate, her heart cried, and I am the ghost you left behind, grown fainter with every passing year. Good evening, my lord, she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. Her own gaze, usually so carefully subdued, was helpless to look away. And thank you for remembering the girl I was, for seeing the woman I am beneath the dust and the quiet. The words shaped themselves in her mind, too bold for her lips. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the connection held. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible pressure of his fingers, he released her hand, turned, and was gone. The door closed behind him. The performance was over. Upstairs in the dark, Elizabeth would lie awake, the echo of his voice and the fire in his dark eyes painting dreams on her ceiling. The phantom had taken flesh, and the world she knew would never be the same. The clock in the hall below struck 2 in the morning. Havelock House was a tomb of satisfied ambition. Algernon and Imogen had retired hours ago, giddy with their social triumph, dissecting every word, every glance from the Marquis, convinced of their own brilliant maneuvering. John had given his aunt a long, sympathetic look before retreating to his rooms. Alone in her chamber, Elizabeth stood at the window, the sapphire gown exchanged for a plain white nightrail, a shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. The cool glass did nothing to calm the fever in her blood. George, not a phantom, not a memory, flesh and voice, and those eyes the same dark, intelligent eyes that had once gazed at her with youthful ardor, now held a depth of sorrow and power that left her trembling. He had defended her in that exquisitely cutting rebuke to Imogen. He had not just been kind, he had been personal. He had spoken of phantoms and true north, as if he knew the very geography of her lonely heart. She pressed her forehead to the pane. The night was clear, a crescent moon hanging over the soot stained rooftops of Bloomsbury. Somewhere across the vast sleeping city, he was under the same sky. How had this happened? How had the brilliant, sober student become the formidable Marquis of Silverwood? The title meant he must be the heir of some distant noble relation. A twist of fate as cruel as it was improbable. A monstrous joke. He had been given everything her father had said mattered: rank, wealth, standing, but it had come too late for them. Had he ever thought of her after he'd inherited? Had he ever considered seeking her out? The questions were a fresh and piercing agony. Perhaps he had simply accepted his new life, leaving the past and the quiet girl from Hampshire buried. The thought was a desolate coldness, worse than any of Imogen's barbs. A hot tear traced a path down her cheek. The injustice was not of the present, but of the past. A profound, quiet grief for the young man she had lost, and for the bewildering, untouchable lord he had become. The gulf between the boy she loved and the man in the drawing room seemed infinite, and in that vast space lay the ruin of her life, built on the desolate belief that he had simply forgotten her. The thought was a strange, sharp pang. She had nurtured his memory as a perfect frozen thing, but he was a man with a man's history. Was he married? The question was a physical pain. He had worn no ring, but that meant little. He had not mentioned a wife. But then why would he at such a dinner? She turned from the window, the moonlight casting her elongated shadow across the floor. She felt it suspended between two worlds: the grey, predictable prison of her present, and the dazzling, terrifying possibility that had just walked back into it. He had looked at her, really looked, and in that look she had seen not pity, but recognition. Across London, in the library of Beaumont House, George Beaumont, Marquis of Silverwood, stood before a dying fire, a glass of brandy untouched on the mantelpiece. The room was a monument to the hollow victory he had won a decade ago. Dark, gleaming wood, shelves of leather bound books, a few good paintings. It was comfortable, imposing, and utterly alien. He felt like a conqueror in a palace whose throne felt like a cage, a constant reminder of the pride paid and the prize forever lost. He had played his part tonight. He had endured the baron's bluster and the baroness's bobs with detached civility. It was a skill he had honed in foreign courts and in the complicated arena of inheriting a vast estate. But the moment he had seen her, all that polished armor had nearly shattered. Elizabeth. Time had not diminished her, it had refined her. The shy bloom of her youth had hardened into a resilient, quiet beauty. The gold of her hair was softened by silver like moonlight on wheat. Her eyes, that clear, perceptive gray, held a lifetime of silent observation. She held herself with a grace that spoke of endurance, not ease, and they were making her life a misery. That much was painfully obvious. The brother, a pompous fortune hunter; the sister in law, a venomous social climber who took delight in publicly flaying Elizabeth's past and her choices. The casual cruelty of the remark had ignited a cold fury in him he had struggled to contain. He had spoken too freely. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Phantoms, true north. It was a message in a bottle, hurled directly at her shores. He had seen the shock in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. He thought of her as she was 20, standing in her father's orchard, the sunlight catching in her hair, her face alight with a trust so complete it had humbled him. He had promised her a life of the mind, of shared quiet, of respect. He had offered everything he was: his intellect, his honor, his unwavering devotion, and it had been scorned. He had left England after her father's refusal, his heart in ashes. He'd buried himself in law, then in diplomatic work abroad, a purposeful exile. The news of his distant inheritance came a few years later, a title, lands, wealth, everything old Stanton had demanded. He accepted the title with a cold sense of duty and a cynical desire to one day wield the very power that had failed him. For a decade, he had been the absent Marquis, ruling from across the sea, the title, a crown of thorns he wore in solitude. Time and duty, however, are relentless masters. The business of the estate could not be managed forever from a distance. His advisers, his seat in the Lords, the expectations of his name, all of it had finally demanded his physical return to England. He had come back to London weary, expecting a life of hollow duty. And all the while the question had gnawed at him, what became of her? Now he knew she was trapped, a bird with clipped wings, in a cage of polished mahogany and stifling propriety, being pecked at by smaller, meaner creatures. The fire in him was no longer the ember of a young man's love, but the fierce, protective blaze of a man who had seen the world's cruelties and had the power at last to defy one. He had noticed the nephew, John, a good lad, with a kind heart and intelligent eyes. He saw the boy's silent defense of his aunt, a potential ally perhaps. George picked up the brandy glass, finally taking a slow sip. The plan he had vaguely formed to cautiously explore the connection, to perhaps call upon the family in a few days, was gone. The sight of her, the sound of their mockery had changed everything. He would not let her suffer another week, another day in that house. He would find a way. A direct approach was impossible. It would expose her to more venom and society's gossip. He need to see her alone, to speak not as the Marquis to Miss Stanton, but as George to Elizabeth. He looked into the fire, the flame reflecting in his dark eyes. The scholar had become a strategist. The heartbroken boy was now a man of influence, and he would use every weapon at his disposal, his title, his wealth, his wits, not to win a prize, but to liberate a soul, to answer a question asked 20 years ago with a lifetime's worth of unwavering intent. 3 days of suspended agony passed at Havelock House. Algernon spoke of nothing but the Marquis's promised club meeting. Imogen relived the dinner nightly, her narrative shifting to imply the Marquis had been utterly charmed by her wit. The snide remarks towards Elizabeth grew sharper, laced with a new suspicious venom after the Marquis's unexpected defense. Elizabeth moved through her duties like an automaton, her mind a whirlwind. She avoided the morning room, took her meals in her chamber on a pretext of headache, and existed in a state of breathless dread. Every carriage that passed the window made her heart stutter. On the fourth morning, a different kind of summons came. John sought her out in the small upstairs parlor, where she was ostensibly mending. Aunt, he said, his expression unreadable, a delivery for you to the house. He held out a flat, rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. It was left with the butler, no card. Her hand trembled as she took it. It was heavy, solid. Books. She knew the weight and shape of it. Dread and a wild, forbidden hope warred within her. Imogen would hear of this. A package for the spinster sister. It would be interrogated. John, thank you. I was in the hall when it arrived, he said quietly, his gaze steady and knowing. No one else need know the particulars. He paused, then added, It's from Hatchard's, the bookseller. I saw the wrapper. A public, respectable provenance, a shield. She offered him a look of profound gratitude. He merely nodded and left her alone. With fumbling fingers, she untied the string, The brown paper fell away to reveal two volumes. Not new, old, their leather binding worn soft with age. Her breath caught. The first was Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. The second was a volume of Cowper's poetry, identical to the one hidden in her chest, the twin of the book he had given her a lifetime ago. She opened the Cowper. The pages were clean, but on the front and paper, in that achingly familiar strong hand, was written not an inscription, but a single line of verse underlined. The calm retreat, the silent shade, with prayer and praise agree. It was from Cowper's poem, The Task, a line about finding peace in solitude. But it was the other book that held the key. With the heart hammering against her ribs, she opened Lyrical Ballads. A slip of paper, a blank, trimmed note, marked a page. The poem was Wordsworth, We Are Seven. A child's innocent insistence that her dead siblings were still present. A poem about enduring connection beyond separation. And there in the margin, in the same ink, was a tiny, precise notation. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, the reading room. No signature, no name. It was an assignation, yet it was not. She understood the daring of it, the intimate, breathtaking cleverness. It was not a lover's missive, it was a scholar's cipher, a shared language only they two could decipher. This was his chosen battlefield, neutral, respectable, intellectual. He was not asking her to meet a lover in a shadowy garden, but to confer with an equal in a palace of thought. It was a test of her courage, disguised as an invitation. It was a promise that the past was not dead. To stay would be the final quiet burial of the girl she had been. For a full hour she simply sat, the books in her lap, her fingers tracing the lines of his writing. The following day, at 1:30, Elizabeth informed a mildly curious Imogen that she intended to return some books to the London Library and seek a new novel. It was a mundane, believable errand. She wore her second best walking dress of soft moss green and a simple bonnet, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her veins. The British Museum was its usual sanctuary of hushed grandeur. The vast reading room under its great dome was a cathedral of thought. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like fairies above the ranks of silent, studious figures. She saw him immediately. He was seated at a long table near a bank of shelves on classical antiquities, as if studying Roman history. He was not looking at her. He was writing in a small notebook, the picture of a gentleman engaged in research. He wore a dark blue coat, less formal than his evening wear, but no less elegant. He looked like what he once was, a scholar. Gathering every shred of her courage, she walked towards the shelves, her steps silent on the floor. She stopped a few feet from his table, pretending to examine a spine. Her throat was so tight she could not breathe. He looked up as if noticing a stranger for the first time. His dark eyes met hers. There was no smile, only that deep, absorbing intensity. Miss Stanton, he said, his voice low, meant only for her amidst the quiet. A coincidence to find you here. The formality of the words was belied by the look in his eyes. My lord, she murmured, her own voice a thread of sound. I often come here. The silence is congenial and necessary, I should think, he replied, closing his notebook. He gestured to the empty chair beside him, not across the table, but beside him, in a space meant for collaboration. Would you care to sit? I find myself in need of a second opinion on a point of translation. It was a pretext so thin it was transparent, and it was perfect. She sank into the chair, her skirts whispering. They were close enough that she could see the fine weave of his wool sleeve, the faint trace of silver stubble along his jaw, the scent of him, soap, leather, and something uniquely him. enveloped her, a scent from her dreams. For a long moment, they simply sat in the palpable quiet, side by side, not looking at each other, surrounded by the wisdom of centuries. The air between them vibrated with the unsaid. She could feel the heat of his sleeve mere inches from hers. Her heart was a frantic living thing against her ribs, a sensation so forgotten it felt violent. You sent the books, she finally whispered, staring straight ahead, her voice thin with a terror that was not of him, but of this fragile, impossible reality. If they were seen, if they were known, it was a reckless gesture. It was a necessary one, he said, his gaze fixed forward, his voice a low, steady vibration that she felt in her very bones. And I was sure you would come. I knew you would understand the cipher. He paused. I remember you valued Cowper above all, and the Wordsworth. It seemed apt. We are seven, she breathed. The poem's title, a question, a plea for the connection it promised. Connection, he affirmed, the word dropping like a stone into the silence, refusing to be severed by distance, by time, by the lives of dying men. He turned his head then, slowly, and the full force of his gaze fell upon her. In the dusty sunlight from the dome, he looked more handsome than memory had any right to paint him. The stark lines of his face softened by a profound intensity, his dark eyes holding a universe of weary, unwavering love. Elizabeth, the sound of her name, her true name, spoken like a vow in this sacred public space, shattered her last defense. A single tear escaped, striking a hot, betraying path down her cheek. She did not move to wipe it away, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his nearness. The 20 years between them dissolved into air. They were simply George and Elizabeth again, hearts laid bare. George, she whispered back, the name a secret, a prayer, a key turning in a long locked door. How? A distant, childless uncle, a title that felt like a mockery, he said, his voice rough, scraping against old wounds he no longer cared to hide. But that came later, long after. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, heavier. I heard your father was failing. I had nothing then, no title, no fortune, just the same stubborn heart he'd already broken once. But I went to him on his deathbed. I knelt beside a man who had despised me and begged him not for rank, not for money, but for you. I told him I would work until my hands bled, that I would give you a life of dignity, if not luxury. I offered him everything I was. His jaw tightened, a muscle flickering. He refused me again. He told me you were content, that you wished for no part of me. His voice cracked just slightly. It was the second greatest lie ever told to me. The first was that I could ever live without you. He looked at her then, his dark eyes blazing with old pain and new resolve. The title came years later. I'd lost count by then, after he died. A bitter joke of fate. Everything he said you needed, and it arrived too late to change his mind and too late to save you from that house. The truth spoke with such raw, unvarnished pain, was a lance that pierced the last of her numbness. He lied, she choked out, the words a sob she stifled into a whisper. I was never told. I thought, I believed with my whole being that you had forgotten. The look he gave her then was one of such profound, anguished tenderness, it stole the very air from her lungs. Forgotten? You were the fixed star, the quiet, perfect truth in a world of noise and falsity. Elizabeth, look at me. His hand shifted, his fingertips coming to rest on the edge of the table, an inch from hers. A connection offered, not taken. Everything I have done, everywhere I have been, it was all just a long, desolate road leading back to this room, to this moment, to you. I have been walking towards you for 20 years. Around them, the word of the museum continued in its silent, solemn pace. But within the sphere of their two chairs, a lifetime of silence was ending, not with a shout, but with a whisper that held the power of an avalanche. The lost time stretched between them, vast and sorrowful, but for the first time they were standing on the same shore of the truth, looking at each other across it, and the distance at last did not seem so very far. And so, my dear listener, part 1 ends here. For part 2, check the link in the description, or you can find it on my channel, Whispers of Old England.